19. How does sugar produce its effects? One reason why many people are skeptical about the suggestion that sugar is bad for health is precisely that the number of illnesses in which I feel sugar plays a part is so large. When my colleagues and I say that so many conditions can largely be avoided or improved by avoiding sugar, it looks as if we had joined the panacea mongers. Take apple cider vinegar, the food faddists say, or brewer's yeast with yogurt or wheat germ oil, and you will stay young and healthy forever. Well, nearly forever. Avoid sugar, I say, and you are less likely to become fat, run into nutritional deficiency, have a heart attack, get diabetes or dental decay, or a duodenal ulcer. And perhaps you also reduce your chances of getting gout, dermatitis, and some forms of cancer, and in general increase your lifespan. It is difficult, certainly, to imagine that the omission of one single food can produce all these benefits, or that its inclusion in the diet can be responsible, at least in part, for so many disparate diseases. Yet I do not believe that my suggestion is in the least implausible. As I have shown, sugar has a wide range of properties that make it a popular constituent of foods and drinks. It is this versatility that is responsible for its use in so many commodities and contributes toward today's high intake of sugar. Because of these very varied properties, it becomes more plausible to imagine that sugar can produce such a large number of varied effects in the body. But research workers are not at all sure of the mechanisms by which every one of the effects can be brought about. Much of what follows, therefore, is inevitably theoretical, but it will, I hope, at least serve the purpose of suggesting some of the lines along which further research can be done. Sugar can be expected to produce its effects in several different ways. First, it can act locally on the tissues in the mouth or stomach before it is absorbed. Secondly, it can act after it has been digested and absorbed into the bloodstream. Thirdly, it might possibly act by changing the types of microbes that live in the intestines. This could result in a change in the microbial products that appear and get absorbed into the blood, and these in turn might affect the body's metabolism. The evidence that sugar acts in all these ways varies from near certainty to highly imaginative speculation, but I think all of it is worth looking at. Even the speculative will serve a purpose if it leads to research designed to elucidate some of the remarkable properties of sugar in the body. Local action. The link between sugar and dental disease. There is wide agreement, as I have already mentioned, about the ways sugar is involved in causing dental decay. The bacteria found in the mouth are stimulated to grow and produce acid by carbohydrates, by starch, and by any sugars that are found in our food. Sucrose, however, is a particularly potent cause of caries for two reasons. First, sucrose is the main ingredient that results in particular foods being sticky and adhering to the teeth. Biscuits and toffees are notable examples. This in itself would be conducive to caries production because the carbohydrate they contain is not washed away. As a result, the acid produced by bacterial action comes into prolonged contact with the tooth surface. But secondly, sucrose, unlike other carbohydrates, has the unique property of being readily built up into a material called dextrin, which serves as a most effective raw material for the acid-producing bacterium, Streptococcus mutans. The link between sugar and dyspepsia. The patients whom we treated in the experiment mentioned in Chapter 16 were suffering from a variety of conditions, including hiatus hernia, duodenal ulcer, or severe dyspepsia, with or without actual ulceration. There is at present a great deal of discussion about the causes of these conditions, but I think we can imagine a way in which sugar can produce or exacerbate an inflamed mucous membrane in the esophagus or stomach, why a low-sugar diet relieves the symptoms, and perhaps even why sugar can actually produce an ulcer. If you think about the natural human diet, by which I mean the diet before the beginning of agriculture, you will see that the constituents of the food would not be irritating to the stomach. This is because they do not have a high osmotic pressure. Let me explain what osmotic pressure is. It is a property of a watery solution that is measured by its tendency to absorb more water to itself in particular conditions. If, for example, you put a strong sugar solution on fruit, the fruit will shrink because its moisture is, as it were, sucked out by the sugar. Or if you pour sugar on a cut in your finger, it will hurt as it does when you put salt on it, though not so much, because salt has an even higher osmotic pressure than sugar has. This again is because the cells of the skin shrivel through having to give up some of their water. The osmotic pressure depends on the concentration of particles, molecules or ions, in the solution. If you are dealing with a material like starch, which has very large molecules, then even a strong solution will not have much osmotic pressure, because it will contain relatively few molecules. On the other hand, a similar concentration of sugar will have a high osmotic pressure because the molecules are small, and so there will be very many more of them. The pre-Neolithic diet, as I indicated earlier, probably contained a fair amount of protein, a moderate amount of fat, and a little starch and sugar. Both protein and starch have large molecules, and fat doesn't dissolve in water at all. So the osmotic pressure would depend mostly on the small amount of sugar in this diet and the very much smaller amount of the other materials with small molecules, such as various salts and vitamins in food. This sort of diet, then, does not irritate such tender tissues as the mucous membrane of the upper part of the digestive tract. Large amounts of sugar, however, especially if taken in concentrated form, on an otherwise empty stomach, will be an irritant. You can actually see the irritation happening if you put a gastroscope into somebody's stomach, which allows you to see the stomach lining. If you now get the subject to swallow a moderately strong sugar solution, the equivalent, say, of 4 or 5 lumps in a cup of coffee, you can watch the mucous membrane turn red and angry as the irritant sugar reaches it. The fact is that sugar, in the quantities that are part of the average Western diet, and especially taken, as it often is, on an empty stomach, will be a source of repeated irritation on the delicate mucous membranes of the esophagus and the stomach. Irritation of the esophagus is the most likely cause of heartburn. As for the stomach, it is not surprising that a high-sugar diet, even for only 2 weeks, can result in the production of more acid and much more active gastric juice, as we showed in our experiments. Finally, it is widely held that duodenal ulceration is a result of excessive secretion of gastric juice, so that it is also not difficult to see why sugar might contribute to the cause of this condition. There is another possible way in which sugar might act on the stomach. As I have shown, sugar affects the adrenal glands, and it is known that some of the hormones produced by this gland increase the production of gastric juice. Sugar would then be producing its effects in the stomach both by a local action and by a general action. Let me repeat that these suggestions are made simply because they constitute a reasonable explanation of at least some forms of severe indigestion. It remains to be seen whether these are the precise mechanisms by which sugar may contribute to the production of duodenal ulcer, for example. But even if the explanation turns out to be different, there is no doubt of the effectiveness in most patients of the low-carbohydrate diet in the relief of symptoms of severe and chronic indigestion. The late surgeon, Commander T.L. Cleve, suggested quite a different mechanism for the cause of peptic ulceration and other diseases of affluence. He believed that all refined carbohydrate is equally responsible. Both white flour and refined sugar cause peptic ulceration, he suggested, because they are concentrated, sugar being concentrated from cane or beet, and white flour from the whole wheat. He believed that it is the stripping of its protein that changes innocuous whole flour into ulcer-producing white flour. The idea behind this is that the protein is necessary for the proper neutralization of the gastric acid. I do not find the theory convincing for 3 reasons. One is that the difference in the protein content between ordinary brown flour and white flour is very little, about 13.5% compared with 13.0%. The exact figures will depend on the sample of flour and the precise way it has been milled. But even flour made from whole wheat contains only a little more protein, perhaps 14.5%. Secondly, bread is not the only source of protein, so the neutralization of stomach acid does not depend entirely on bread, either brown or white. Bread contributes about 17 grams of protein a day to the average British diet, where the total intake of protein is about 100 grams. The difference between eating bread from the whole wheat and eating ordinary white bread is something like 1 gram of protein a day, and rather less if you ate the commoner sorts of brown bread rather than whole wheat bread. Thirdly, our own experiments have shown that if the amount of starch in the diet, mostly from white bread, is reduced and its place taken by sugar, there is a great change in gastric juice. The effects of bread and of sugar are too different for them to be lumped together as equally dangerous refined carbohydrate, as we pointed out in Chapter 6. General action. While we don't know for certain how sugar can produce disease, I do believe that some sort of pattern is beginning to emerge. Now we must put up some reasonable theory based on this pattern, so that further experiments will reveal more of the pattern. Of course, we shall have to change our theories if they turn out to be wrong. In trying to understand how sugar can be involved in causing so many diseases and abnormalities, 2 results of our work have especially impressed me. One is that sugar produces an enlargement of the liver and kidneys of our experimental animals, not only by making all the cells swell up a little, but by actually increasing the number of cells in these organs. In technical terms, sugar produces not only hypertrophy, but also hyperplasia. The second effect that seems to be important is that sugar can produce, at least in some people, an increase in the levels of insulin and estrogen, and a more striking increase in the level of adrenal cortical hormone. It also produces an enlargement of the adrenal glands in rats. It should be remembered, too, that these effects are more likely to occur when the blood is repeatedly flooded with high levels of the glucose and fructose produced when the sucrose is digested. This, in fact, is what happens, partly because, as the advertisement tells you, it is rapidly digested and absorbed, and partly because people so often take sugar in food and drink between meals when there is little else in the stomach to delay absorption. To begin with, the effects on hormones and on liver and kidney should persuade any reasonable person that sugar is not just an ordinary kind of food. Secondly, its effect in producing raised hormone levels makes it possible to see how sugar can be implicated in such a large number of conditions. It also, I suggest, indicates why people may develop one disease rather than another disease. For the hormones maintain a most intricate interrelationship, both in the amounts circulating in the blood at any one time and in their actions on the body's metabolism. It seems to be always true that an increase in the amount of one hormone results in an increase or a decrease of several of the other hormones. In a general way, the effect is a tendency to restore the state of the body to what it was before. This occurs because some of the actions of different hormones oppose one another, while some enhance one another. But the likelihood is that, after all the readjustments following the increase of one hormone, some actions of the whole group would still not be in balance. I would expect that the details of the ways in which these attempted readjustments are made vary from one person to another. Imagine a sudden flood of water into a stream. It eventually forces its way through a weak part of the bank. You now repair this rapidly, but you can fetch material only from some other parts of the bank. Stones and gravel and mud and sand, a little from several places. When you repaired the breach, you weakened other parts of the bank. Only the next flood will tell you which part will now give way. It will depend on so many things, and two streams that seem to be identical will almost certainly behave differently when the stress comes. Of course, you can pretend that the situation is really much simpler. It is not difficult to imagine that sugar causes diabetes because it makes the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas overwork until they become exhausted. And this may in fact be so for some sorts of diabetes. I say this because there is a growing belief that diabetes is not just one disease, or even the two diseases in the young and in the middle-aged to which I referred earlier. So there may be a complex mechanism by which sugar produces diabetes, or some sorts of diabetes, and not enough is known about the disease to try and unravel the mechanism. With atherosclerosis, I have worked out the possible mechanism simply for my own benefit, because it gives us ideas of what new experiments we should undertake. This working hypothesis starts with the assumption that the underlying cause of the disease is a high level of insulin. The reasons for this belief are several. First, many people who have definite atherosclerosis have a high level of insulin in the blood. Secondly, several circumstances increase the risk of coronary disease, and they include cigarette smoking, overweight, peripheral vascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. Each of the first three, and often diabetes 2, is associated with an increased level of insulin. Thirdly, reduction of excess weight or increased physical activity, both of which reduce the risk of developing coronary disease, result in a fall in insulin levels. Fourthly, experiments with rats have shown that administration of insulin produces an increased amount of cholesterol in the aorta. Finally, it does look as if some people are much more likely to get coronary thrombosis than other people are, so it would be understandable that only some people react to sugar by a raised level of insulin. But the most cogent reason for believing that insulin, or perhaps some other hormone, underlies the process that ends as coronary disease is the multiplicity of changes that accompany the disease. As I have said several times, we are looking for the mechanism that produces a condition involving not only a raised level of cholesterol and triglycerides, but also a range of other disturbances in biochemistry, in platelet behavior, and in a number of other characteristics. Only a disturbance of hormone levels is likely to afford an explanation of such a wide variety of changes. At the moment it seems that the most likely first change is a rise in insulin level. But at least two other hormones are affected. As I showed, there is great interplay between the activities of the various hormones. It may therefore turn out that the first disturbance is in some hormone other than insulin, and that the rise in insulin level is secondary to this. We do not have nearly enough information yet to decide this question, but I am convinced that further work on hormonal activities is by now the most promising line of research that we should be pursuing. In discussing the possible role of hormones in producing atherosclerosis, it is wise to remember that the sex hormones certainly play a part, that coronary disease is much more common in men than it is in women, but that the difference diminishes after menopause when there is a diminution in the activity of the female sex hormones, and that there is a particularly close relationship between the hormones made by the sex glands and some of those made by the adrenal glands. It is not yet possible to begin to describe how atherosclerosis develops. Not enough is known about it. Yet it is perhaps worth some speculation. Let me suppose that the first change induced by a diet high in sucrose is a change in the amount of enzymes in body cells, such as the muscle cells. You can imagine that, over many years, a continuation of a high-sugar diet results in a decreased ability of the cells to carry out their normal metabolic processes properly. They now become unable to use properly their ordinary metabolic materials, such as glucose, for which they require hormones, especially insulin. As a result, the level of glucose in the blood rises. In order to overcome this disability in the cells, the pancreas increases the amount of insulin it makes and puts it into the bloodstream. The increased insulin enables the cells now to begin to deal with the glucose and other substances. At this point, the situation may lead to the condition of diabetes, or at least those manifestations of the disease called type 2 diabetes. But insulin produces many other actions and on many cells other than muscle cells, and these, one may suppose, were not affected by the sucrose in the diet. As far as these other activities are concerned, there now exists an excessive amount of insulin. One result would be to change the balance of several of the other hormones. Another result would be to produce effects such as increased fat formation or obesity. And still other results would be to increase the accumulation of cholesterol and other fatty materials in the arteries, perhaps to change the properties of the platelets, and altogether gradually to produce the condition known as atherosclerosis. Not all of these suggestions are original, although I have to take the responsibility of putting them all down here in what may ultimately turn out to be a quite incorrect sequence. And I would be the first to agree that this is an extremely hypothetical picture. I put it down, nevertheless, for two reasons. First, it indicates a possible role of sucrose in atherosclerosis that is not entirely implausible. Secondly, it sets up a hypothesis that can help research workers make decisions about what further experiments should be carried out. I do not think it is worth pursuing my argument because so much has to be speculation. Let me just say that hormone changes certainly affect the skin, the rate of growth of an animal, and its sexual maturity, and that there is growing evidence of the relationship between hormones and some forms of cancer. It is enough for now to say that sugar produces many profound changes in body metabolism. It is therefore quite possible to imagine that it can be concerned in a wide range of diseases, including those such as diabetes and atherosclerosis, which in themselves manifest profound disturbances of metabolism. Microbes in the digestive tract. The third way in which sugar might act is by altering the numbers and proportions of the huge numbers of different microbes that inhabit the intestine. They exist and multiply in the residues of food that have not been absorbed or digested. The sorts of food that have been eaten will determine the kinds and amounts of these materials, which in turn will affect the proportion and numbers of the intestinal microbes. Unfortunately, medical science is still not very knowledgeable about such details in human beings, although it is certain that changes are produced when sugar replaces starch. While we do not yet know what effect these may have on the rest of the body, there does seem to be something to say about the replacement of part of the milk sugar, lactose, by ordinary sugar, sucrose, for babies. It is known that bottle-fed babies, who often have sucrose added to cow's milk so as to bring the total sugar content nearer to the amount in human milk, tend to have gastroenteritis, diarrhea and vomiting, much more commonly than do breastfed babies, who get only lactose. It has also been shown that the stools of breastfed babies contain many more harmless lactobacilli than do the stools of bottle-fed babies, and far fewer of the potentially harmful coli bacteria. Again, stools of breastfed babies tend to kill off added harmful bacteria. Those from bottle-fed babies allow them to multiply. These findings suggest that the intestinal contents can make a baby either more or less susceptible to infection. The research workers attribute this largely to the fact that bottle-fed babies get only part of the sugar as lactose and the rest as sucrose. It has been suggested that diverticulitis, an uncomfortable disease of the large bowel associated with pain and diarrhea, may be in some way caused by modern diets. One widely accepted suggestion is that it comes from eating food with little residue, especially white bread instead of the more fibrous wholemeal bread. Earlier in this chapter, I told you why I don't think one can explain duodenal ulcers and other diseases of Western man in this way. I do think, however, that a possible cause of diverticulitis is the increase in sugar intake at the expense of starch. The different types and numbers of microbes that occur when this dietary change is made could well influence the bowel itself, altering both its activity and its resistance to damage. Sucrose in the blood. I pointed out that the sugar we eat is digested into glucose and fructose before it is absorbed into the blood. This digestion is usually quite complete except when very large amounts of sugar are consumed. In these circumstances, very small amounts of undigested sucrose can get into the bloodstream. As we are beginning to find out, sucrose has several potent actions in living cells, and so it is quite conceivable that these tiny amounts, over a long period of time, can produce damaging effects on the body tissues. This is at present pure hypothesis, but it is a suggestion that future research must pursue.